I now call the Security Council meeting to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security, upholding multilateralism and the United Nations-centered international system. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the President of the UN General Assembly, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2021/416, a letter dated 29th April 2021 from the Permanent Representative of China to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept note on the item under consideration. I warmly welcome the President of the UN General Assembly, ministers, and other esteemed representatives participating in this BTC meeting. Your presence today underscores the great importance of the subject matter under discussion. I now first give the floor to Mr. Volkan Bozkır, President of the UN General Assembly.
Ministers, Excellencies, thank you for convening this timely debate on an issue which is of great importance to the General Assembly. It is a privilege to brief the Security Council on behalf of the 193 member states of the United Nations. I also thank your delegation here in New York, and in particular Ambassador Wang, for his participation in the recent high-level interactive dialogue with the principals of the main organs of the United Nations to commemorate the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. Mr. President, Excellencies, let me begin by stating unequivocally, strong and effective multilateralism based on the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, international law, and justice are the foundations for security, stability, peace, and prosperity. Importantly, the multilateral system benefits all of us, from small states to the largest ones. Multilateralism plays a crucial role in fostering dialogue and trust, managing security challenges such as terrorism and weapons proliferation. And it provides a framework for states to resolve disputes peacefully and without coercion. In September, world leaders affirmed in the declaration on the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations that multilateralism is not an option, but a necessity. Therefore, we must be clear during these discussions that there is no alternative to the current system. As imperfect as the multilateral system may be, we must acknowledge that we are at the helm. Member states are the United Nations, and that failures are our own. Great enterprises are dynamic and should evolve in sync with the realities in which they operate. The multilateral system centered around the United Nations is no exception, and it is incumbent on us to refine and update the system, which is indispensable. We have many examples of success. From the UN Charter, and over the last 75 years, a web of treaties and norms have developed to promote cooperation in relation to global challenges in areas as diverse as civil aviation, hazardous waste, health security, and human rights. But unacceptable levels of human suffering remain. Moreover, due to the multidimensional effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, our world is currently facing the deepest global economic recession since the Great Depression and the largest loss of incomes since 1870. Foreign investment is gradually decreasing. The livelihoods of billions of people are under threat. Global extreme poverty numbers are expected to rise for the first time in 20 years. Approximately 115 million people are on the verge of falling into extreme poverty. It is calculated that 235 million people will need humanitarian aid this year. Meeting the humanitarian needs of the most vulnerable 160 million people requires $35 billion. Approximately 690 million are at risk of malnutrition. In 22 countries, violence and conflict are the root causes of the hunger, affecting 77 million. Millions of people are on the move. Millions are displaced due to conflict, persecution, hunger, or climate change. Millions had to flee their homes, countries ending up as refugees. The scale of suffering is difficult to comprehend fully. But it is unimaginable to think of the extent of hardship and death that would unfold in a world without the United Nations. We can never afford to forget the impact our actions have on the people of the world. Mr. President, Excellencies, under the Charter of the United Nations Security Council is entrusted with a special responsibility in relation to international peace and security. But the threats to international peace and security affect more than the 15 members of the UN Security Council. Right or wrong, for millions of people around the world, the Security Council is the face and embodiment of the United Nations. Its success or failure to achieve its mandate is seen as the success or failure of the United Nations. On many occasions, the Council has been divided and unable to rise to the challenge. For most of those cases, the reason of failure is the differences between its members, in particular its permanent members. Reform of the Security Council is a core interest of UN member states. It is a core interest of the UN itself, as well as it goes to the heart of its legitimacy. We need a more representative, accountable, transparent council. I'm conveying this as the president of the most democratic organ of the system. Mr. President, Excellencies, as members of the General Assembly, you are of course aware of a number of the issues before you, which are also on the agenda of the General Assembly. A just and lasting settlement to the Israeli-Palestine conflict on the basis of the vision of two states is still pending. The Palestinian people have been living under occupation for over 50 years. Essential needs of the Palestinian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the occupied Palestinian territory are met by UNRWA, the longest-standing UN agency and a lifeline for more than 5 million Palestinian refugees. Hence, providing sufficient and sustainable financing to the agency is essential. The largest humanitarian crisis has unfolded in front of our eyes for a full decade now in Syria, with hard-to-describe ordeals. Nearly 16.2 million are food insecure in Yemen, where famine remains a serious threat for almost a decade. Libyans have been suffering also for almost a decade. The situation in Myanmar is a matter of deep concern. The military coup was a strike on the democratic process in the country, and the increasing loss of life since then is alarming. In the same spirit of responsibility for the people we serve, I join the ASEAN leaders' call for an immediate end to the violence in Myanmar. I'm deeply concerned about the humanitarian implications of the military's action in Myanmar, particularly as they affect the most vulnerable communities, including the Rohingya Muslims, ethnic minorities, women, and youth. Later this month, I will travel to Cox's Bazar, which hosts over 800,000 refugees who fled Myanmar in search of safety. Mr. President, Excellencies, I firmly believe that we need to meet and speak with the people for whom peace has thus far been elusive. Indeed, I recently visited the Hatay region on the Turkish-Syrian border, where I met with Syrian refugees. At the UN's transshipment hub in Reyhanlı, OCHA representatives show me the aid delivery process and its monitoring mechanism. I have to tell you, standing on the truck, surrounded by the UN personnel who put their lives at risk to save the lives of others, and again, as I looked out over Atme tent city, I asked myself, how long must the Syrian people endure such hardship? If the international community, in this 75th year of the United Nations, fails to step up to end this suffering, who will? There is no backstop. We are responsible for the fate of the most vulnerable. To this end, I call on you to ensure that the vital cross-border assistance continues uninterrupted. It is my most fervent hope that the Council will renew this critical mandate in July and work together to reinforce efforts to bring about peace in Syria. Mr. President, Excellencies, I urge all member states of the United Nations, including the members of this Council, to strengthen implementation of the Charter, to formulate rules and processes that expedite justice when it comes to human rights abusers and those who violate international humanitarian law. These actions should be the baseline for the rules-based international order. The lack of accountability for serious crimes signifies our collective failure to enable all mechanisms and tools of the multilateral system to prevent violations from occurring and reoccurring. Furthermore, all COVID-19 recovery plans and humanitarian responses must be centered around human rights and the protection of civilians. For actions taken without accountability and full regard for human rights will never reach the most vulnerable in society. This includes the equal and fair distribution of COVID-19 vaccines for all. Mr. President, Excellencies, let me be clear in this context. Protection of civilians equals vaccines for all. Without vaccinating the people we serve, we are in a literal sense failing to protect civilians from the most widespread deadly threat facing the world today. Many issues that cross our desks do not have easy solutions or even plausible solutions. However, we can end COVID-19 if we work together. I commend the recent steps taken to waive intellectual property protections on COVID-19 vaccinations. Once approved by the World Trade Organization, this much-needed development will support increased vaccine production that will enable us to save lives. The task ahead of us is clear. We have the ammunition to defeat this universal adversary. Yet at this moment, only 0.3% of all vaccines have been given to low-income countries. I repeat, 0.3%. We can do better. We must do better. The COVID-19 pandemic is not a zero-sum game. Good intentions are no match for vaccines in arms. Mr. President, Excellencies, it is clear that conventional approaches will not bring about peace or shape an equal, resilient, and sustainable world. Just as peace and development, mutually reinforcing respect for human rights is a foundation for peace and security as well. We need to reinforce UN reforms. which support an integrated approach to the challenges we face. Sustaining peace requires us to address peace and security challenges in all their dimensions. This is the moment of reckoning to fulfill our commitments to our generation, future generations, and our planet. Mr. President, Excellencies, I thank you, and I look forward to our continued cooperation for the remainder of the 75th session as we work to create a better world for all.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your briefing. The General Assembly is an important institution for putting multilateralism into practice and the primary platform for greater democracy in international relations. We support greater contacts and interaction between the General Assembly and the Council to make new contribution to improving global governance and enhancing the effectiveness and authority of multilateralism.
I shall now make a statement in my capacity as State Councillor and Foreign Minister of China. Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, colleagues, last September, at the high-level meeting to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, President Xi Jinping expounded on the essence of multilateralism and underscored the importance of sticking to multilateralism as the path forward. Leaders of all nations also reiterated in a declaration on the commemoration of the UN's 75th anniversary that multilateralism is not an option but a necessity. The United Nations is the banner of multilateralism. To pursue multilateralism, we must follow the basic norms governing international relations built around the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, uphold the authority and stature of the UN, and ensure its central role in international affairs. That is what it means to practice multilateralism, an intrinsic nature that is absolutely incompatible with unilateralism. As the world goes through a raging pandemic and profound changes rarely seen in a century, we need to firmly commit to the path of cooperation, mutual benefit, and win-win, and to put real multilateralism into practice. In this context, China wishes to propose the following. We should engage in win-win cooperation, not zero-sum games. The more complex the global issues are, the greater the need for collective response. The more daunting the challenges facing all humanity, the greater the need for solidarity and unity of our heart. What is needed is dialogue and cooperation on the basis of equality and mutual respect among all countries. No country should expect others to lose. Rather, countries must work together to ensure that all come out as winners and to achieve security and prosperity for all. We should pursue equity and justice, not bullying or hegemony. Promoting democracy and international relations is central to ensuring international equity and justice. It is essential that all countries share the responsibilities of global governance and work together for peace and development. The key is to promote law-based international relations, observe universally recognized international laws and norms, and honor international agreements adopted by all parties. International rules must be based on international law and must be written by all. They are not a patent or a privilege of the few. They must be applicable to all countries, and there should be no room for exceptionalism or double standards. We should focus on action rather than rhetoric. Multilateralism means taking actions and finding solutions. Otherwise, it will not stand its ground and will not sustain. The actions we take must not be short-sighted. We must always act in the common interests of all, and bear in mind that each and every country will benefit from what is best for the world. The actions we take must also serve long-term needs in addition to immediate ones, and no action should be taken for the sake of expediency at the expense of the long-term peace and sustainable development of the whole world. Major countries in particular must lead by example to provide global public goods. We should respect diversity instead of seeking one's own supremacy. Every country has its unique history and culture and needs to take a path of development suited to its own realities. This diversity, together with the common values of peace, development, equity, justice, democracy, and freedom, will unleash the great power of multilateralism. On the other hand, however, splitting the world along the ideological line conflicts with the spirit of multilateralism and is a regression in history. Colleagues, the UN is like a mirror and a benchmark to show whether multilateralism works and whether it works well. The UN was founded with a mission to preserve peace. It is important that the UN continues to focus on this primary responsibility, promote dialogue and consultation, resolve differences, end conflicts through mediation and good offices, and address hotspot issues through political means. Sanctions and other enforcement measures should be used only after all other non-enforcement means are exhausted and for the purpose of seeking political settlement. All unilateral moves that circumvent the Security Council are illegitimate and must be abandoned. Elevating development to the same important status as peace is a vital initiative of the UN. What is important for the UN now is to build global consensus more effectively and promote peace and human rights through development. The UN needs to pay more attention to the difficulties facing developing countries, make their voice heard, address their concerns, and protect their rights and interests. Most important, the Sustainable Development Goals must be achieved on time and with high quality by 2030. Non-traditional security issues have as much impact on humankind as the trauma of wars and conflicts. For the UN, it is important to pursue a new vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and lay more emphasis on public health, counterterrorism, climate change, and other non-traditional security threats to eliminate the root causes of crises and cement the foundation for security. The Security Council can play a bigger role within its mandate. The ongoing pandemic has also amplified the unadaptable side of the global governance system. The UN needs to keep pace with the times. It should improve its efficiency, emergency response capability, and transparency of its work through reform. Earnestly increase the representation and voice of developing countries, and make the global governance system more just and equitable. Colleagues, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. We have successfully eradicated extreme poverty and embarked on a new journey toward a modern socialist country in all respects. This year also marks the 50th anniversary of the restoration of the lawful seat of the People's Republic of China at the UN. These 5 decades have witnessed China's active practice of multilateralism, its full participation in and support for the cause of the UN, and its continuous contributions to world peace and development. To maintain peace, China is always committed to political settlement of hotspot issues. Having participated in more than 30 UN peacekeeping operations, China has become the largest contributor of peacekeepers among the permanent members of the Security Council. To promote development, China is fully implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We have met the goal of poverty reduction 10 years ahead of schedule. We are also advancing high-quality Belt and Road cooperation, which will lend impetus to global development. To protect the eco-environment, China has contributed to the conclusion of the Paris Agreement on climate change and announced its targets for peaking carbon emissions and carbon neutrality. The time span between these two targets of ours is much shorter than that in developed countries. To defeat the pandemic, China launched the largest emergency humanitarian operation since the founding of New China and has been providing vaccines to other developing countries as a global public good. to boost global solidarity in fighting COVID-19. At the new historic starting point, China will continue to hold high the banner of multilateralism, thoroughly implement the major initiatives announced by President Xi Jinping at the high-level events marking the 75th anniversary of the UN last year, and continue to support the UN-centered multilateral mechanism with concrete actions. China will remain a builder of world peace, a contributor to global development, a defender of international order, and a provider of public goods. We stand ready to work with all parties to bring multilateralism and the UN forward from a new starting point, and jointly build a community with a shared future for mankind. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I will now give the floor to other Council members. I give the floor to His Excellency Ralph Gonsalves, Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the preceding speakers for their remarks and commend China for convening this important debate. As a small country whose continued peaceful existence depends on the norms and principles of international law and the multilateral system in which these tenets are enveloped, Saint Vincent and the Grenadines places particular emphasis on today's discussion. This foundational principle is applicable to and for all states, large and small, in every part of the world. Commandis, bullying, or threatening behavior by any state in relation to another is antithetical to this precept and portends dangerous consequences for all. Last September, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of this treasured institution. We celebrated too the many successes and achievements realized in our collective quest for peace and prosperity. Yet there is still much more to be done and to be ever more focused, creative, and relevant in these complex and changing times. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the reality that a renewed multilateralism remains an urgent moral, political, and existential imperative, undergirded by the UN Charter principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Amidst the severe health, socioeconomic, political, and security implications of COVID-19, states are required to contend with the ever-intensifying hazards of climate change, the continued spread of terrorism and organized crime, increased hunger and acute food security, political polarization, disinformation, and hate speech, the escalation of ethnic and intercommunal tensions, and in far too many contexts, conflict and mass human displacement. These contemporary challenges are inextricably interconnected, and they will not be successfully addressed by any short-sighted, unilateral, or military means. To the extent that many of these issues stretch across borders and more easily overwhelm the limited capacities of vulnerable states, effective and coordinated multilateral action is an essential condition for any sustainable solution. Only a comprehensive whole-of-system approach would suffice in addressing the peace and security, developmental and humanitarian concerns of the affected states. Mr. President, in the face of vast but continually expanding peace and security challenges experienced globally, we must move quickly in a fresh direction. Bold and innovative steps are needed to alleviate human suffering, especially in conflict-affected settings. Capacity building and development assistance should be scaled up, and national ownership over peace and political processes strengthened. Practical, inclusive, people-centered, and climate-sensitive solutions ought to be developed and implemented in line with national needs and priorities and in accordance with the Sustainable Development Goals. It is necessary and desirable that all states must work together constructively and within the framework of international law, with the support and assistance of the United Nations and relevant regional and sub-regional organizations to achieve this vision of a more peaceful and prosperous world. When disputes do occur, they ought to be settled amicably and equitably through dialogue, diplomacy, mediation, and other participatory approaches, rather than through unilateral or coercive means. There can be no substitute for trust and mutual respect. Any deviation from these universally accepted norms, wheresoever and by whomsoever committed, severely undermines the ideals of multilateralism embodied in the UN Charter. Saint Vincent and the Grenadines reiterate its commitment to these guiding principles. To conclude, Mr. President, let us all be reminded of our forebears' vision of unity and solidarity as they fashion this United Nations system. As we seek to confront the unique and complex challenges of the 21st century, including a sustainable recovery from the COVID pandemic, which, as we all know, has already destroyed far too many lives and livelihoods, the extant circumstances demand the presence of a renewed and effective multilateralism, steeped in the virtues of inclusivity, equality, and justice, and guided by the principles of international law. We cannot remain separated by narrow interests or be divided in purpose. We must work in committee even more together, urgently and resolutely, to realize peace, security, and development for all of humanity. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Prime Minister for his statement. Establishing platforms for medium and small-sized countries to equally participate in international affairs should be an important component and objective of multilateralism. I now give the floor to His Excellency Antony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States of America.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Let me start by thanking China and Foreign Minister Wang for initiating this critical discussion on the future of the United Nations and the international order. And thank you as well to the President of the General Assembly, Buzz Kier, for your leadership. When countries came together after World War II to form the United Nations, virtually all of human history up till then indicated that might made right. Competition inevitably led to collision. The rise of a nation or group of nations necessitated the fall of others. Then, our nations united in choosing a different path. We adopted a set of principles to prevent conflict and alleviate human suffering, to recognize and defend human rights, to foster an ongoing dialogue, to uphold and improve a system aimed at benefiting all people. The most powerful countries bound themselves to these principles. They agreed to a form of self-restraint, as President Truman put it, to deny themselves the license to do always as they pleased, because they recognized that this would ultimately serve not only humanity's interests, but their own. The United States did this, even though it was by far the most powerful nation on earth at the time. It was enlightened self-interest. We believed other nations' success was critical to ours. And we didn't want less powerful countries feeling threatened and obliged to band together against us. In the years since, we faced daunting challenges, from the divisions of the Cold War, the vestiges of colonialism, and the times the world stood by in the face of mass atrocities. And today, conflicts, injustice, and suffering around the globe underscore how many of our aspirations remain unfulfilled. But no period in modern history has been more peaceful or prosperous than the one since the United Nations was created. We avoided armed conflict between nuclear powers. We helped millions of people emerge from poverty. We advanced human rights as never before. This bold endeavor, whatever its imperfections, has been an unprecedented achievement. And it's endured because the overwhelming majority of people and nations continue to see it as representing their interests, their values, their hopes. But now, it's in serious jeopardy. Nationalism is resurgent. Repression is rising. Rivalries among countries are deepening. And attacks against the rules-based order are intensifying. Now, some question whether multilateral cooperation is still possible. The United States believes it is not only possible, it is imperative. Multilateralism is still our best tool for tackling big global challenges, like the one that's forcing us to gather on a screen today rather than around a table. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed life as we know it across the planet, with millions of deaths and devastating impacts on economies, health, education, social progress. The climate crisis is another massive threat. If we don't move swiftly to cut emissions, the results will be catastrophic. We built the multilateral system in part to solve big complex problems like these, where the fates of people around the world are tied together and where no single country, no matter how powerful, can address the challenges alone. That's why the United States will work through multilateral institutions to stop COVID-19 and tackle the climate crisis. And we will abide by the core principles of the international order as we do. We'll also work with any country on these issues, including those with whom we have serious differences. The stakes are too high to let differences stand in the way of our cooperation. The same holds true for stemming the spread and use of nuclear weapons, delivering life-saving humanitarian assistance, managing deadly conflicts. At the same time, we will continue to push back forcefully when we see countries undermine the international order, pretend that the rules we've all agreed to don't exist, or simply violate them at will. Because for the system to deliver, all countries must abide by it and put in the work for its success. There are three ways we can do that. First, all members should meet their commitments, particularly the legally binding ones. That includes the UN Charter, treaties and conventions, UN Security Council resolutions, international humanitarian law, and the rules and standards agreed to under the auspices of the World Trade Organization and numerous international standard-setting organizations. Let me be clear. The United States is not seeking to uphold this rules-based order to keep other nations down. The international order we helped build and defend has enabled the rise of some of our fiercest competitors. Our aim is simply to defend, uphold, and revitalize that order. Second, human rights and dignity must stay at the core of the international order. The foundational unit of the United Nations, from the first sentence of the Charter, is not just the nation state. It's also the human being. Some argue that what governments do within their own borders is their own business, and that human rights are subjective values that vary from one society to another. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights begins with the word universal, because our nations agreed there are certain rights to which every person, everywhere, is entitled. Asserting domestic jurisdiction doesn't give any state a blank check to enslave, torture, disappear, ethnically cleanse their people, or violate their human rights in any other way. And this leads me to my third point, which is that the United Nations is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of its member states. A state does not respect that principle when it purports to redraw the borders of another, or seeks to resolve territorial disputes by using or threatening force, or when a state claims it's entitled to a sphere of influence to dictate or coerce the choices and decisions of another country. And a state shows contempt for that principle when it targets another with disinformation or weaponized corruption, undermines other countries' free and fair elections and democratic institutions, or goes after journalists or dissidents abroad. These hostile actions can also threaten the international peace and security that the United Nations Charter obliges this body to maintain. When UN member states, particularly permanent members of the Security Council, flout these rules and block attempts to hold accountable those who violate international law, it sends the message that others can break those rules with impunity. All of us must accept the scrutiny, however difficult, that comes with the commitments we freely made. That includes the United States. I know that some of our actions in recent years have undermined the rules-based order and led others to question whether we are still committed to it. Rather than take our word for it, we ask the world to judge our commitment by our actions. Under the Biden-Harris administration, the United States has already re-engaged vigorously in multilateral institutions. We've rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, recommitted to the World Health Organization, and we're seeking to rejoin the Human Rights Council. We're engaged in diplomacy to return to mutual compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and to strengthen the nuclear non-proliferation regime. We are by far the largest contributor to COVAX, the best vehicle for the equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, and we're making tens of millions of doses available to others without political considerations. We're also taking steps with great humility to address the inequities and injustices in our own democracy. We do so openly and transparently for people around the world to see, even when it's ugly, even when it's painful, and we will emerge stronger and better for doing so. Likewise, it's not enough simply to defend the rules-based order we have now. We should improve and build upon it. We need to take into account the change in power dynamics over the past 8 decades, not only between countries, but within them. We need to address legitimate grievances, particularly unfair trading practices that have provoked a backlash against an open international economic order in many countries, including in the United States. And we must ensure that this order is equipped to address new problems, like national security and human rights concerns raised by new technologies, from cyber attacks to surveillance to discriminatory algorithms. Finally, we need to modernize the way we build coalitions and who we include in our diplomacy and development efforts. That means forging non-traditional partnerships across regional lines, bringing together cities, the private sector, foundations, civil society, and social and youth movements. And we must improve equity within and between our countries and close economic, political, and social gaps that persist based on race, gender, and other parts of our identity that make us who we are. At the founding of this institution, President Truman said, "This charter was not the work of any single nation or group of nations, large or small. It was the result of a spirit of give and take, of tolerance for the views and interests of others." He said it was proof that nations can state their differences, face them, and find common ground on which to stand. We continue to have profound differences among the UN member states and within this council. But the United States will spare no effort to find and stand on that common ground with any country that upholds its commitments to the order we founded together and which we must defend and revitalize together. That's the great test of this moment. Let's meet it together. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your intervention. Indeed, multilateralism is a sure path for all nations to attain enduring peace and sustained development, and this requires all countries, in particular major countries, to work for it. I'm sure that all countries would be glad to see the United States changing course and make a real contribution to practicing multilateralism. I now give the floor to His Excellency Sergei Lavrov, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, allow me to express to you, as a State Councillor and Minister for Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China, our gratitude for organizing today's debate. The theme of upholding multilateralism and strengthening the UN-centered international system is undoubtedly more pertinent than ever and deserves the attention on a constant basis of the UN Security Council. The world is at a turning point in its development. The coronavirus pandemic has proved to be a serious challenge for absolutely everyone. Our normal way of life has undergone fundamental changes, although positive trends have also been seen thanks to the mass application and administering of COVID vaccines. The long-term and, as it were, delayed effects of the crisis are still hard to predict. The pandemic broke out in what was far from an ideal world. A growth in international tension, the exacerbation of regional conflicts, and the emergence of cross-border threats and challenges have become signs of the times. The entire architecture of global governance that was created following the end of the Second World War is being sorely tested. It is evident that prospects for the sustainable and predictable development of the international community are directly linked to our ability to find effective solutions to common problems and our readiness to demonstrate collective leadership in the interests of genuine multilateralism. Russia, like the majority of states, believes that this work needs to be done exclusively on the basis of universally recognized norms of international law. The key platform for pulling these efforts together should still be the United Nations, which is the backbone of the modern world order, where all independent states are represented. Today, its unique legitimacy and its unique capabilities are particularly in demand. The core postulate of international law in the UN Charter, and those postulates have been tested by time. Russia calls on all states to unconditionally adhere to the purposes and principles of the Charter when forming their foreign policy, ensuring respect for sovereign equality of states, non-interference in their internal affairs, the settlement of disputes through political and diplomatic means, and a rejection of the threat of force or the use of force. This is particularly important at the current stage in the complex formation of a multipolar system of international relations. Given the objective growth of new centers of economic, financial development and political influence, it's necessary to preserve the international legal basis to draw a resilient balance of interests that corresponds to these new realities. Unfortunately, not all of our partners are guided by the imperative of working honestly to establish genuine multilateral cooperation. They've come up against the impossibility of advancing their unilateral or bloc priorities within the UN, and leading Western countries are now trying to roll back the process of establishing a multipolar, polycentric world and try to restrain the course of history. This includes the concept of the so-called rules-based order, a concept that was thought up as a way to replace international law. I don't need to recall that international law is already made up of a set of rules, but these are rules that were agreed at universal platforms and which reflect the consensus or broadest possible consent. The aim of the West is to pit these joint collegiate efforts of the international community against other rules that are developed in closed, non-inclusive formats and which are then imposed on everyone else. We believe that these actions in circumvention of the UN are harmful and they aim to usurp the decision-making process whilst claiming to have global application. This list also includes the well-known idea of convening a summit of democracies that the American administration is calling for, creating a new special interests club on an openly ideologized basis could further exacerbate international tension and draw dividing lines in the world, a world which needs a unifying agenda now more than ever. And incidentally, the list of democracies that are being invited to this summit will inevitably be drawn up by the United States themselves. Another allegedly global leadership initiative is being advocated in circumvention of the UN, the French and German Alliance for Multilateralism. Now, strengthening multilateralism should be considered specifically within the United Nations, but Berlin and Paris think otherwise, and they are issuing their own joint document on the subject of the European Union as the cornerstone of the multilateral system, and are advancing the European Council as the central role of the European Union and European institutions in advancing multilateralism. You might say that's immodest, but the EU does not think so when they declare their exclusiveness. And incidentally, during discussions with Western colleagues, we propose that we discuss the state of democracy not just within states, but also in the international arena. But when we do so, they seem to lose interest in the discussion. As part of this alliance of multilateralists that I referred to, more and more initiatives are being declared about the creation of so-called partnerships, narrow partnerships, and yet partnerships on those same matters that are already discussed in the UN or the specialized agencies in its system. Examples of this are the so-called calls for security in cyberspace. 65 countries participate in that. The call for respect for international humanitarian law, 43 countries. The partnership in support of freedom of information and democracy, slightly more than 30 countries participate in that. And there are other initiatives as well. These demonstrate the genuine relationship, the real relationship that the UN has to multilateralism in the UN. Multilateralism, which in the West is seen not as something that's been produced by a universal format to find solutions, but rather it's something they see in terms of their claims to come up with a system that everyone needs to agree to. Another example of this method is the West's practice of unlawful unilateral sanctions that are introduced without any international legal basis, with the sole aim of punishing regimes that have fallen out of favor or to take opponents out of the game. During the pandemic, these restrictions have significantly reduced the ability of a whole host of developing countries to combat the spread of the virus. Despite the call of the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, to suspend these sanctions in the context of the pandemic, in the majority of cases, we are only seeing them being tightened. We believe that these steps to impose totalitarianism in global affairs are unacceptable, but they are being used more and more widely by our Western colleagues, chiefly the European Union, the United States, and other allies, rejecting all the principles of democracy and multilateralism in the international arena. They say that the world should be the way that they want it to be, and otherwise they'll punish them. Western actors also aren't ashamed to say that the main aim of global politics should be to combat attempts by Russia and China to change the rules-based order. These statements were made the other day following the ministerial meeting of the G7 in London. That is to say that this change in concepts has already taken place. The West is no longer worried by the concepts of international law, and now they will simply fulfill and implement their rules and the rules-based order that they have established. And the American representative did not worry about saying that it was the United States and the United Kingdom that were chiefly behind this. I'm saying all of this not to whip up confrontation and rhetoric and make accusations. I'm simply listing facts. And if we are all actually saying that we're in favor of multilateralism, then let's honestly together try to find ways to establish it justly without attempts to prove anyone's primacy or to undermine anyone's rights. We are convinced that this approach of upholding multilateralism and the UN-centered system will guide the actions of the Secretary General and his team. We are convinced that recognizing modern realities of a mutually linked world means that what we need today is an honest partnership and cooperation between all states on a pragmatic, ideology-free and depoliticized basis. That's the only way to improve the atmosphere in the world and to ensure the predictable development of humanity, particularly when we're talking about global challenges such as the fight against terrorism and combating WMDs, climate change, new infectious diseases, ensuring human rights, starting with the very most basic one, the most important one, the right to life. And I agree with Secretary of State Blinken, who recently underscored that these global challenges affecting the lives of our citizens cannot be tackled by one state alone, not even the United States. A key role in launching a frank, direct dialogue about the most acute problems of the modern age should be played by the permanent members of the UN Security Council, who, in accordance with the Charter, bear particular responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. President Putin proposed the convening of a summit of the leaders of the P5, and we hope that this idea will become a reality once the epidemiological situation around the world has been normalized. In conclusion, I would like to underscore that the UN, as the main international platform, must keep pace with changes in the international arena. The organization needs to steadily adapt to changing conditions, and any changes need to fully respect the division of labor between the main charter organs of the UN and enjoy the support of all member states. At every stage of this change, a measure of our actions should be genuinely increasing the effectiveness of the UN. Russia is ready to support constructive cooperation with all partners that support these approaches in the interest of strengthening the authority and unleashing the full potential of the UN as the genuine center of multilateralism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister Lavrov. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, Russia has always been an important force for maintaining international peace and security. Particularly given the current circumstances, Russia has made many calls to maintain international law, the Charter of the United Nations, to choose solidarity over division. This is of a real practical significance and is a real manifestation of multilateralism. I now give the floor to His Excellency Marcelo Ebrard, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Mexico.
Le agradezco, Ministro.
I'd like to thank Minister Wang Yi for convening this timely debate. And I welcome the participation both of the President of the General Assembly and of other ministers and high-level officials. Mr. President, we are experiencing one of the most shocking crises of history. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that international peace and security are multidimensional. It has uncovered several vulnerable aspects of multilateral organizations. Global challenges such as natural disasters, climate change, migration, which involves suffering for many people, and of course pandemics such as the one we are experiencing, can go so far as to affect peace and security and the stability of states and the international community as a whole. We must learn the lesson of this pandemic. Science worked, but not solidarity or the international sense of justice. The issue that brings us together today gives us the possibility of reiterating the commitment of the members of the Security Council to the values and principles of the United Nations. Mexico therefore reiterates its support for the statement of the General Assembly upon its 75th anniversary. It states clearly that multilateralism, more than an option, is a need, and that there is no other institution or international organization that has the legitimacy, the convening power, or the standard-setting impact of the United Nations. But the United Nations, particularly the Security Council, must be more open to hear the needs and aspirations of the peoples, and beyond words, to act by putting people at the heart of all their actions and decisions. Mexico defends multilateralism both as a question of principle and because our national interest is to contribute to robust, effective global governance, which is needed to administer our shared global goods, which will serve all countries equally, regardless of their economic level or political power. Lasting peace, which is needed for sustainable development, can only be built through mutual understanding, cooperation, and solidarity. Multilateral fora are the ideal space to build confidence through dialogue, respect, and inclusion. Mexico calls once again to keep larger channels of dialogue open with all actors within this council. Inclusion of all parties is fundamental to resolve a crisis in the conflict. In this regard, it is indispensable to have greater participation of women and young people. It is only in this way that we will be able to underpin diplomatic dialogue as the natural instrument for effective, inclusive multilateralism. Any action leading to deadlock undermines the legitimacy of collective security mechanisms we have so laboriously built. But it also increases the lack of confidence which already exists in the international community when it comes to the timeliness and effectiveness of multilateralism. The time this Council took to issue its first resolution on the COVID-19 pandemic is a clear example of this. The Security Council has a special responsibility, not only because of the mandate given to it by the Charter, but also because of the expectations it generates. We therefore believe that it must be more active in promoting compliance with its decisions within the framework of international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. Mexico advocates a comprehensive reform of the Security Council to make it more transparent, democratic, representative, and effective, more accountable, and updating its working methods. While this reform takes place, which obviously is not an easy matter, there are actions to be undertaken for the Council to be more transparent. For example, Mexico has proposed to discuss the letters in which the right to legitimate self-defense is invoked in light of Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, on which the Council appears to not take action. We also reiterate the call to the permanent members of the Council in particular to join the Franco-Mexican Initiative on the voluntary restriction of the veto in case of mass atrocities. The fight against impunity and the provision of humanitarian assistance should not be held hostage to the various policies which precisely have led to the inaction and deadlock of this Council. Mr. President, I conclude by reiterating the call for states and international organizations, both multilateral and regional, to join the effort for the effective implementation of resolutions 2565 of the Security Council and 74/274 of the General Assembly of the United Nations for equitable access to vaccines, for them to be recognized as a global public good and to be applied without exclusion to all countries, including those which are in conflict. The Security Council, the entire United Nations system, has the opportunity and the responsibility to exercise its leadership and the primacy of multilateralism just now when it is most needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your intervention. Mexico, as an emerging major power, has been committed to strengthening multilateralism and actively participating in international cooperation. We look forward to Mexico playing a greater role in enhancing global challenges. We will now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Wu Tan-som, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Vietnam. Please.
Mr. President, I thank you and the Chinese presidency for convening this important meeting. Let me also thank the President of the General Assembly for his insights. Mr. President, During the first Vietnamese presidency in January 2020, the Council adopted a presidential statement reaffirming its commitment to multilateralism and to the UN Charter and an international order based on international law, which the Council recognized as the foundation of a more peaceful, prosperous, and just world. At no other time are these words more relevant given the current state of the world. And I commend the Chinese presidency for holding this open debate to once again reinforce our commitment to multilateral cooperation. Indeed, multilateralism has inserted itself as the rightful course to be pursued and embraced by our community of states. As described by Dag Hammarskjöld, the United Nations has since its founding been a new Santa Maria, sailing its way through storms and uncharted water, and bringing us all together in the quest for peace, stability, and development. Today, multilateralism offers the most effective solutions for emerging and complex global challenges. Arms race, weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, terrorism, transnational crimes, climate change, and in particular the current COVID-19 are but a few examples that global challenges can only be addressed through vigorous and effective multilateral cooperation. We are stronger together by working together. We are progress. Moving forward, Mr. President, I wish to underline three critical issues. First, in the words of Secretary General Guterres during the debate on upholding the UN Charter in January 2020, and I quote, "At this time of global divisions and turmoil, the Charter remains our shared framework of international cooperation for the common good," end quote. Upholding international law and the UN Charter is increasingly urgent and important as they lay the solid foundation for the consolidation and flourishment of an international order and a multilateral system that serve the common interests of the international community. In other words, we must foster a culture of compliance with international law and stand against the use of force, coercion, power politics, and unilateralism in relations. Second, regional organizations and the United Nations are embodiments of multilateralism at different levels that greatly complement each other in maintaining international and regional peace and security. This was the main thrust of the discussion at the open debate convened by Vietnam last month. The presidential statement adopted by the Council also highlighted the importance of expanding collaboration between the UN and regional organizations in confidence building and dialogue in prevention and resolution. In our region, ASEAN has affirmed its centrality in regional security architecture in addressing regional and international issues, including the situation in Myanmar or the maintenance of peace and stability in the South China Sea. Third, multilateral institutions must be reformed and work in synergy so they can function in an ever more effective and responsive manner and adapt with evolving international environment to better serve the interests of member states on the basis of equality, mutual benefit, inclusiveness, and leaving no one behind. The Security Council is no exception. To fulfill its primary responsibility in the international peace and security, the Council needs to be reformed to enhance transparency, democracy, representativeness, and effectiveness, and improve its working methods. Mr. President, on this 67 years ago, our victory at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu marked the end of colonial rule in Vietnam and the region. It contributed to the colonialization process that led the fast expansion of the membership of the United Nations and multilateral UN-centered cooperation in general. Today, as a non-permanent member of the Council, but a permanent member of the nations, Vietnam reaffirms its commitment to contribute to multilateral endeavors, global solidarity and partnership to achieve the ultimate goals of sustainable peace and development. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your intervention. Since Vietnam's membership in the Security Council, it has brought the ASEAN spirit of openness, inclusiveness, and thorough consultation into the Security Council. It has played an important role in promoting dialogue and de-escalating tensions, and helping easing tensions and promoting cooperation between the Security Council and the regional organizations. Now, give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Asumi Masudu of Niger, please.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam. Ladies and gentlemen, ministers, Mr. President of the General Assembly. Mr. President, it's with true pleasure and significant attachment to the ideals of our common organization that I am taking the floor for the first time before the United Nations Security Council in my capacity as a Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of the Republic of Nigeria. I would like to take this opportunity to express my most sincere gratitude and my full availability to continue our exchanges of cooperation with each and every one of your countries. I would also like to convey the most sincere gratitude of His Excellency, Mr. Mohamed Bazoum, for your congratulations on his election to the presidency of Niger. Mr. President, I should also like to thank the Chinese presidency for the very wise choice of this extremely important topic of our debate today, which is maintaining international peace and security, multilateralism, and the international system focused on the United Nations. As was recalled by speakers who preceded me, the United Nations account is par excellence multilateralism and the appropriate venue for maintaining. As set forth in the first chapter of the United Nations, the principles which underpin multilateralism call upon member states to privilege collective measures with a view to preventing and stopping threats to peace while respecting member states' sovereign equality. End of quote. It is aware of this that my country has not ceased to reiterate its firm attachment to this ideal and to provide its ongoing support to the bolstering of the principles of the international system focused on the United Nations. And it is, for that matter, the very reason which my country organized during its presidency of the Council last September, a high-level debate on the quote, and I quote, world governance in the post-COVID world, end quote. It's important to underscore here that the health crisis caused by the pandemic of COVID-19 highlighted the insufficiencies of our instruments for world government and laid bare the insufficiencies of the international system, including the Security Council. In this regard, it is time to breathe new life into multilateralism by endowing the United Nations system with effective means so that it can fulfill its missions in an adequate manner. Indeed, the world as we knew it in the aftermath of the Second World War is quite different from today's world, and our current instruments are no longer sufficient to grapple with world challenges such as health crises, poverty, climate change, terrorism, international organized crime, cybercrime, etc. Given what I have just said, if I may, Mr. President, I'd like to make a couple of recommendations with a view to strengthening international solidarity and cooperation in the context of multilateralism to address issues of peace and security with which the international community is currently confronted. First, it is necessary, more than necessary, to restore trust in a system which is too often perceived as inequitable and not representative of certain countries or continents. Africa, for example, which fully participates in the work of the Security Council, has no permanent representative in this body, despite its active participation in more than 50% of Security Council meetings, 60% of the final documents that are crafted, and 70% of resolutions and mandates which arise from Chapter 7. It is why the Security Council is more than ever necessary. And thus my country fully subscribes to the African common position expressed through the El Zawini consensus, which calls for full representation of Africa within the Security Council, with at least 2 permanent seats and a single status for all permanent members, especially with regard to the right to veto. Moreover, it is time to broaden the scope of the Security Council's action, taking into account the new challenges that I just mentioned, which can undermine international peace and security. Health crises, poverty, climate change, terrorism, international organized crime, cybercrime are all specific problems, specific to our century, which should be addressed wisely and without complacence by the Security Council. Above and beyond issues of reforming the Security Council, there are other international organizations that need to be addressed, such as the IMF, the World Bank, and other specialized institutions. For our security, we need a change of paradigm, a major change, especially to change the approach of the Security Council's approach and policy. Our issue is not just managing conflict. We also have a fundamental responsibility of preventing conflict. And in this regard, it is vital to understand the causes, effects of, and complexities of changes underway in order to grapple with the issues for our society. Secondly, we need to strengthen cooperation and coordination between the United Nations and regional and sub-regional organizations. And here I'd like to underscore and applaud the partnership that exists between the United Nations and the African Union, which is eminently positive in promoting multilateralism. It is our desire to see this partnership further strengthened by promoting confidence-building measures and dialogue to bolster efforts of prevention of conflicts on the African continent. Finally, we must learn the lessons of the economic, political, and social consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on international peace and security. It is a time then to reiterate, following the President of the African Union Commission and the Secretary General of the United Nations, that COVID-19 provides us with a unique opportunity for a rebirth of multilateralism based on institutions which are capable of acting decisively, based on a world consensus for our common well-being. The pandemic thus calls upon us to bolster bilateral, regional, and interregional partnerships. It also calls upon us to develop better coordination, both with United Nations agencies and with international financial institutions. To conclude, I'd like to reaffirm that the world today, more than ever, needs institutions and regulations which are strong. And while it's true that defending national interests governs foreign policies of states, national interests are best defended in cooperation and complementary and solidarity. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Minister for his statement. Niger has been committed to approaching African issues in the African way, supported stronger cooperation between the United Nations and the Security Council and the African Union and other regional and sub-regional organizations, adding new dimension to multilateralism. I now give the floor to His Excellency Simon Coveney, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister for Defence of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me first to congratulate you, Minister, on China's assumption of the presidency of the Council. I also wish to thank you very much for organising today's important debate on promoting multilateralism. I'd also like to thank President Bozkır for his powerful words today. When China last held the presidency of this Council in March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic cast a dark shadow across many parts of the globe. There's one clear lesson coming from what we have collectively faced over the last year, and that is that global challenges are too great for any nation, regardless of their size or their means or their power, to face alone. We can only face them successfully when we face them together. A strong and fair rules-based international order with the United Nations at its core remains our best option, our only option, to address the multitude of challenges that we face across the world. Mr. President, I'd like to make 4 key points today. First, the complexity and interdependency of our world requires a functioning multilateral system. We depend on a network of multilateral institutions to govern and regulate the international economy and trade, global public goods such as health and the environment, and many other areas of human activity central to our way of life. These institutions must operate in an open, equitable, and a rules-based manner. Through the UN and regional organizations, we are working collectively to reduce poverty and hunger, promote and defend human rights, increase access to education and healthcare, protect migrants and refugees, advance gender equality, and build sustainable peace. Vital institutions, such as the Human Rights Council and the International Criminal Court, uphold international law and protect human rights, which need to apply equally to everybody. Through the COVAX facility, vaccines are being delivered to millions of people, with a lot more still to do. The World Health Organization continues to support states in fighting the pandemic and preparing for the next pandemic. In February, this council spoke in unison to demand that parties to conflicts facilitate the delivery of vaccines. Landmark agreements, such as the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, seek to shape a sustainable and secure future for all of the inhabitants of this planet. Collective multilateral engagement enhances our sovereignty rather than diminishes it. This wider system of multilateralism may have its shortcomings, and I'll return to this point in a minute, but without it, we would face a world ruled by might and zero-sum competition, rather than one shaped by partnership and cooperation. And we don't have to look too far to the lessons of history to see where that road leads us. My second point, Mr. President, is that multilateralism is essential if we are to achieve the promise of the UN Charter to spare succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The UN and this Council have a unique legitimacy for the maintenance of international peace and security. No other body can aspire to represent humanity in all its rich diversity and complexity. To take one example, peacekeeping operations continue to play a critical role in preserving peace, preventing the resurgence of conflict, and protecting civilians. Peacekeeping saves lives and prevents conflict. For more than 6 decades, Irish women and men have served in UN peace operations across the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. They have served proudly alongside peacekeepers from across the world, including many countries on this Council today. Peacekeepers now face new challenges, and we must ensure that they are fully equipped to meet those challenges. We must also prepare so that when the time comes for peacekeepers to leave, we have put in place the resources and planning to preserve the peace that they leave behind. We need to become much better at linking peacekeeping to peace building, ensuring continued and sustained support for countries emerging from conflict and there are far too many of those, and finding durable solutions to the causes of those conflicts in the first place. Thirdly, just as no state alone can adequately address global challenges, no one arm of the multilateral system can craft the solutions that we need today. We see this in many arenas, but let me take one example, an obvious one. Climate change is the defining challenge of our generation. Its impact is global, and our collective security is very much at risk. The future of this planet and of generations to come relies upon facing up to that reality. A concerted multilateral response with all organs of the United Nations, including this Council, playing their role is urgently needed. We must match our ambition with action. We know that climate change can exacerbate existing tensions and drive conflict and insecurity, but we also know that effective climate action can build peace. As co-chair with Niger of the informal expert group of Security Council members on climate and security, Ireland is working to forge consensus on this critical issue, and I would urge all countries and colleagues to join us in those efforts. Mr. President, my final point. To sustain and uphold the legitimacy and relevance of the United Nations, we need to see institutional and political reform in the United Nations. Ireland is a strong advocate for the Secretary-General's reform agenda. The UN must be capable of addressing intersecting challenges that cut across each of its three pillars. Our citizens don't live in separate boxes labelled human rights, peace and security, and/or development, nor do global challenges, climate change, migration, conflict and fragility, inequality. They don't fit neatly into separate boxes. Extensive efforts have been made to promote greater collaboration across the pillars of this organisation, including across the humanitarian, development and peace-building nexus. Important progress is being made to improve the effectiveness and cohesion of the UN development system, and I want to recognise and applaud those efforts. But we cannot address the issues facing the multilateral system without reforming this Council itself. Ireland has long argued for a larger and more representative Council. I reiterate my call today to address the historic and unjust underrepresentation of Africa as a continent, for example. We also need to assess not just our actions, but also our inactions on this Council. Too often, this Council has been unable to act to alleviate immense suffering due to the use or the threat of the use of the veto. Such inaction affects the legitimacy of our whole system and the trust that people have in it. Such inaction is unacceptable, and I would argue immoral also at times. Each of us at this table has a responsibility to find the political will necessary to build consensus. Those who sit here permanently bear a particular responsibility. A reformed and more representative Council that better reflects global 21st century realities would have enhanced legitimacy. That legitimacy is essential to deliver on this Council's mandate to maintain international peace and security for the sake of every country. So let me conclude. We have a collective responsibility to strengthen and defend the United Nations and the international rules-based order. We must uphold the multilateral system, promote respect for international law, and ensure that the United Nations is equipped to meet these global challenges. Ireland takes these responsibilities very seriously, and I know others do too. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Mr. Minister, for your statement. Ireland has all along placed great importance on the role of the UN and has been advocating the fulfilling of the mandate of the Security Council, and this is also a consensus shared by the international community. I now give the floor to His Excellency Othman Jarandi, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Migration and Tunisians Abroad of the Republic of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. أود في البداية
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to congratulate Mr. Wang, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China, on his country's presidency of the Security Council, and we welcome your choice of theme for today, that is to say, upholding multilateralism and making multilateralism more effective in the fight against the common threats facing humanity. I would also like to thank Mr. Volkan Bozkir for his extremely important briefing and for his laudable efforts at the head of the General Assembly to strengthen the performance of the United Nations. I would also like to wish a welcome to the Prime Minister of Niger, participating for the first time in the work of the Security Council. I wish you every success in your noble efforts. Mr. President, last September, His Excellency, the President of the Republic, called upon the United Nations to show greater unity around the new series of values which are in lockstep with our time. During the celebration of the 75th anniversary of the creation of the United Nations, our country's leaders agreed on the fact that multilateralism is not a choice, rather it is an urgent imperative, and that the United Nations is the best platform to pool our efforts and achieve a safer, more equitable, more stable world, and a world that is better able to overcome crises. Without question, the sensitive time period that people are going through as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and its harmful repercussions needs to strengthen our commitment to multilateralism and bring us to support the United Nations and its specialized institutions, as well as international organizations. This universal challenge has proven that our fate is a shared one, and if we can only effectively combat this common challenge through cooperation at the international level in the context of multilateralism, and this was reiterated in Resolution 2532 that was unanimously adopted by the Security Council on the 1st of July 2020, following a French-Tunisian initiative in line with the appeal made by the President of the Republic at the start of the pandemic. He called for a global concept for international peace and security to be adopted. We welcome the international efforts that have been made thus far. However, although these efforts are significant, they are not in line with the scale of the challenge. A lot still needs to be done to strengthen our resilience in the face of this new pandemic and in the face of both old and new challenges. Mr. President, our world today is not in the best state, because the COVID-19 pandemic is compounded by other inextricably linked challenges which are just as dangerous as the pandemic. These include armed conflict, the backsliding of development, acute malnutrition, human rights violations, and climate change, and the spread of terrorism and violent extremism. Recent changes on the international arena and the fundamental change in the nature of the threats we face demonstrate that any country, regardless of its capacities, cannot tackle these challenges alone. They should be tackled through international coordinated efforts based on the mechanisms of effective and constructive multilateralism. The United Nations must be at the heart of these efforts, and these efforts must be led by the General Assembly and the Security Council. Our only choice today is to commit to international law and to refrain from any unilateral act. The Charter of the United Nations and international law must be respected, as well as international conventions and treaties, and we must commit to implementing the resolutions of the Security Council to strengthen its credibility. Today, it is important that we evaluate the United Nations system and that we find ways to develop this organization to make it more effective and more flexible, and to make its organs more flexible as well, to meet the aspirations of the peoples of the world to peace, security, democracy, and development, and to embody the purposes and principles of the United Nations in its work. In this context, Tunisia reiterates that it is very important that we demonstrate our commitment to multilateralism through an effective approach to dealing with these various challenges, beginning with the equitable and rapid distribution of the COVID-19 vaccine, and by ensuring socioeconomic recoveries, as well as by ensuring food security, health coverage for all, and above all, for the most vulnerable countries. Mr. President, since joining the United Nations in 1956, Tunisia has demonstrated that it is truly committed to the United Nations Charter because we believe in the importance of this charter as a reference framework for universal values and international law, which is the basis of multilateralism. We have thus spared no effort since then to support the United Nations in achieving its objectives, and we have actively participated in its organs. We have all agreed on the central role of the United Nations, which also requires real participation from all states and greater support for the current reform process to ensure that the United Nations is in step with the world of today and can cope with new challenges. In this context, Tunisia supports intergovernmental negotiations for reform of the Security Council, and we believe it is high time that a consensus be found on this reform that would make the Council more democratic, more representative, more effective, and more transparent in order to strengthen the legitimacy of the Security Council and to bolster the trust placed in the United Nations. By way of conclusion, Mr. President, I would like to say that strengthening the United Nations as the primary platform for multilateralism requires that we promote its ability to cooperate and coordinate activities with other stakeholders, such as international and regional organizations, financial institutions, and economic groups. And this undertaking also requires that we be open to non-governmental organizations, civil society, the private sector, and academia in order to ensure a more effective and comprehensive response to the challenges that we face. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Minister, for your statement. Tunisia is an African member of the Security Council and a representative of Arab state. We are confident that Tunisia will continue to commit to multilateralism and make a greater contribution to multilateralism and international cooperation. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Rachel Omamo, Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs of Kenya.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President. And allow me from the onset to congratulate you, Excellency Wang Yi, on China's assumption to the presidency of the Security Council this month and for convening this important debate. I also thank His Excellency Bozkir, the President of the General Assembly, for his briefing, and welcome our colleague, the new Foreign Minister of Niger. Mr. President, rarely in the last 30 years has effective multilateralism been as sorely needed as it is today. The COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically showcased the interconnectedness of our world. The coronavirus has touched all of us, exposing state vulnerabilities, revealing stark inequalities in our societies, and unveiling latent weaknesses within the international institutions. Despite regular calls for global solidarity, responses to the pandemic have in many instances paradoxically spawned increased isolationism, nationalism, and protectionism, thereby diluting state cooperation and depleting the potency of multilateral agencies. In fact, the stark absence of widely accepted rules, norms, and principles to guide the international system through this crisis has become apparent. For this reason, Kenya has joined other states in appealing for a pandemic treaty domiciled within the World Health Organization framework. We would encourage all states to embrace this noble cause so as to enhance rule-based multilateralism. Mr. President, although Kenya wholeheartedly welcomes and appreciates the establishment of the COVAX facility, vaccine access and distribution has become one of the greatest tests to multilateralism today, and poses an existential threat to global peace and security. It ought to be the duty of this Council to affirm this truism. Mr. President, there is a real and present danger that many states in the global South will remain excluded and neglected in the face of growing vaccine nationalism and vaccine hoarding, as well as the uneven production of vaccines. Vaccine exclusion, coupled with the dire economic challenges confronting African states, for instance, will impede global recovery and the return to normalcy for everyone. We therefore fully support the African Union in advocating for international cooperation in expanding vaccine manufacturing within the African continent, as well as for the waiver of international property rights in relation to COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics in order to democratize and accelerate large-scale production worldwide. Access to vaccines, particularly within the context of a global pandemic, is a fundamental human right, which the multilateral system must jealously uphold. Mr. President, as the world tackles the COVID-19 crisis, terrorism and violent extremism endure, especially on the African continent. Thus, multilateral approaches to subdue these threats must be bolstered without delay, driven by an invigorated consensus derived from UN Security Resolutions 1267 and 1373. In this regard, Kenya persists in her demands for the listing, without exception, of acknowledged terrorist groups such as Al-Shabaab under the Council's sanctions regime. Without a consistent, strong, and unyielding multilateral consensus against terrorism, we risk providing space for the expansion of these terrorist groups. Further, a firm multilateral consensus must also be established around the nexus between international peace and security and climate change. It is no longer tenable, in our view, to underestimate the devastating effects of climate change, both as an underlying cause and a multiplier of conflict and insecurity throughout the world. Accordingly, this Council ought to pronounce itself unequivocally on this matter and offer the leadership and momentum required to galvanize global action against climate change, related risks to international tranquility and security. Finally, Mr. President, Kenya fervently believes that the success of the United Nations largely depends on its cooperation with regional and sub-regional organizations in line with Chapter 8 of the Charter. Intensifying this inextricable interdependence, especially in the arena of peace and security in Africa, is imperative. Accordingly, the principle of complementarity must attain its salient place in the Council's vision and decision-making. Besides this, as we seek to build back better in the throes and the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis, the expansion of the permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council to reflect our world's diversity is both urgent and necessary. Multilateralism without inclusion is unsatisfactory and limited. Mr. President, Kenya affirms her commitment to a rule-based ethos, strengthened by robust multilateralism and secured by the United Nations Charter and international law. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Madam Minister. We are appreciative that you spoke against vaccine nationalism. We believe that to ensure accessibility and affordability among developing countries is truly practicing multilateralism. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ina Eriksen Søreide, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Norway.
Mr. President, I would like to join others in thanking you, Foreign Minister Wang, for calling and presiding over this important meeting, and also to the President of the General Assembly, Mr. Hoskin, for your intervention. The Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights are keystones of modern international relations. And 75 years ago, the Australian ambassador, Norman Makin, the first president of the Security Council, opened the very first council meeting with the hope that, and I quote, the Security Council will be a great power for good in the world and bring freedom from fear, which is necessary before we can hope for progress and welfare in all lands, end quote. Freedom from fear. That is what this is about, not just for states, but also for individuals in their daily lives. Norway is convinced that respect for and protection of human rights is a prerequisite for durable international peace and security. Mr. President, it is vital in this day and age that we reiterate our commitment commonly to non-aggression and to the principle of justice and international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. We must safeguard and strengthen the international order that has served us so well for 75 years. We are dependent on and also best served by a predictable rules-based international order which makes the world safer and more stable. We're also best served by a world order where small and large states cooperate to find common solutions, where major powers are prevented from acting unilaterally and where right prevails over might. In fact, the very hallmark of multilateralism is to commit beyond one's narrow self-interest. Absence of inclusive democracy, marginalization of minorities, authoritarian rule and repression, these are the root causes of violent conflict. And conflicts have become increasingly protracted in nature, having devastating effects on civilians and civilian infrastructure, and pose a threat to international peace and security. Myanmar and Tigray are among the most recent examples. The Security Council has played a key role for 75 years. It has prevented, de-escalated, and resolved conflicts. Some peacekeeping operations mandated by the Council have been successful, illustrated by the UN being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1988. Some have failed, and we must learn from those failures. Our focus should always be on achieving concrete results for people affected by conflict. The protection of civilians, including children, must remain at the core of our efforts. We must combat sexual and gender-based violence in conflict. Sexual violence is not a side effect of conflict. It's a weapon in war, and impunity has to end. We need to turn commitments into compliance and resolutions into results. The inclusion of women in peace efforts will be crucial to our success. No society can truly succeed without the active involvement of women. Mr. President, we need to build on the legacy of the United Nations to confront new challenges, including inter-ethnic, inter-religious conflicts, pandemics and cybercrime, climate-related conflicts, and the rise of non-state armed actors. These are all pressing issues. Climate change has been recognized as a threat multiplier that will aggravate existing conflicts and can also lead to new ones. It's vital that the Council has access to fact-based information on climate-related security risks in specific conflict contexts when it takes its decisions. A threat that deserves wider attention is piracy, robbery at sea, and related maritime crime. The Security Council can and should authorize more robust action to make the world's oceans safe and secure for maritime commerce. Mr. President, we need to create a more inclusive multilateralism, drawing on the contributions of civil society, business, academia, and other sectors. And we must recognize once again that no state alone, no matter how powerful, can resolve all the challenges that are before us. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Excellency, for your intervention. Norway has been actively mediating for the settlement of hotspot issues, and we count on Norway to continue to play a constructive role in this process. Now I'll give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Eva Maria Lemets, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Please accept my warm greetings to you and to the people of China. I warmly welcome Your Excellency, Mr. Bozkir here. I would like to thank the Chinese presidency for organizing this important meeting today. Estonia has always been a firm supporter of rules-based international order built on the understanding of respect for and promotion of international law, including human rights law and international humanitarian law, democracy, rule of law, and fight against impunity. The COVID-19 pandemic has only highlighted why we need this method of diplomacy. Both the United Nations and the Security Council lie at the heart of the multilateral system. Mr. President, we have achieved a lot over the past 75 years, but we cannot stop here. We must remain committed to our core values and principles that were agreed upon in the United Nations Charter. The promotion and protection of human rights is one of the most efficient means of conflict prevention and clearly linked to the maintenance of peace and security. In this context, we render our full support to the Secretary General's call to action for human rights. The United Nations, with its well-established structure of human rights treaties and their monitoring mechanisms, has a central role in the protection and promotion of universal human rights. We support improved information exchange between the Security Council and the Human Rights Council, special procedures, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It is crucial that the Security Council takes into account and considers the valuable work of the High Commissioner and the Human Rights Council in its deliberations. Estonia maintains its strong commitment to the implementation of its human rights obligations, and we consider the Universal Periodic Review process as a useful element of this work. On Tuesday this week, Estonia participated in our third Universal Periodic Review. Estonia also continues to focus on the most vulnerable, including women and children affected by conflicts. That is why today, Estonia, with our partners, is organizing an informal Security Council meeting on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on grave violations against children affected by armed conflict. This meeting will launch the study prepared by the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict on this topic. Mr. President, we must remain committed to the rules-based international order where international law, including in cyberspace, is followed. respect for territorial integrity, and the prohibition of the use of force are fundamental principles of international law that stand at the core of the United Nations and our values. Therefore, we are observing with concern the ongoing violations of international law, including the United Nations Charter in Europe, in Ukraine, and Georgia. Estonia strongly believes that multilateral diplomacy cannot hold without cooperating with a wide range of actors. For example, strengthening civil society engagement at the United Nations, including at the Security Council, is vital for ensuring effective policymaking. I see with regret how many civil society activists are being harassed and suffer from reprisals by rough regimes. Dear colleagues, the declaration that was adopted to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations reaffirmed that multilateralism is not an open but a necessity. It's not an option but a necessity. However, in order to address new and emerging challenges, we need new practices and agreements to enrich multilateral cooperation. Digital technologies are higher on our agenda than ever before. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 crisis has also amplified challenges around digitalization, including the digital divide that still exists worldwide. To close this gap, we need global partnerships and collaboration. Estonia is actively contributing to the Secretary General's digital cooperation process. We are also happy to collaborate with the GovStack initiative to develop a digital governance reference architecture together with Germany, the International Telecommunication Union and the Digital Impact Alliance. It will accelerate national digital transformation and the digitalization of government services and thereby contributes to achieving sustainable development goals. Climate change poses a real threat and therefore needs a global answer. To make COP26 a real success, we must all set ambitious targets and take actions today. Estonia has set the target of reaching climate neutrality by 2050 and established a clear timeline for phasing out fossil fuel-based energy production by 2040. We cannot be successful in this field without the availability of data and effective data management. Estonia has launched the Data for the Environment Alliance, which will support the United Nations Environment Programme in developing a global environmental data strategy by 2025. We invite all countries to join this alliance. Due to the clear links between climate and security, the Security Council should also show leadership in this field. In conclusion, multilateralism is an inevitable choice in order to meet global challenges. I can promise you that Estonia shall continue to stand for multilateral cooperation and international law. We remain a responsible and active partner to all other UN members during this crisis and beyond. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Excellency, for your intervention. We value your commitment to international cooperation and international law. You also expounded on your understanding of multilateralism, and we hope that through our discussions, we could increase mutual understanding and build more consensus on multilateralism. I will now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Harsh Vardhan Shringla, Foreign Secretary of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. I congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for the month of May and appreciate your initiative in organizing this high-level meeting on the topic of maintenance of international peace and security, upholding multilateralism at the United Nations-centered international system. Given the high expectations from the United Nations and multilateral systems, particularly at this time when the world is confronted by several global challenges, not least the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, such a discussion is indeed relevant and timely. I also take this opportunity to thank His Excellency, Mr. Volkan Bozkir, the President of the General Assembly, for sharing his insights. Envisioned with the noble objective of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war, the establishment of the UN in 1945 heralded a new era of international relations committed to maintaining international peace and security, upholding international law, respecting obligations arising from mutually negotiated treaties, and promoting fundamental freedoms for all humanity. Founded on the principle of sovereign equality for all its members, the UN today is the most universal and representative international organization. The UN has been credited with largely keeping the peace over the last 7.5 decades and for contributing in many ways to the betterment of the lives of the world's humanity. At the same time, it has been found wanting in its ability to garner a concerted response to tackle the world's most complex challenges. Several contemporary global challenges have come to the fore, such as terrorism, radicalism, pandemics, climate change, threats from new and emerging technologies, growing asymmetric threats, disruptive role of non-state actors, and the intensifying geopolitical competition, all of which call for a robust multilateral response. While the UN has addressed most of these issues somewhat partially and intermittently, our collective effort has nonetheless fallen short in providing effective and enduring solutions, particularly due to the infirmities within the multilateral system. Mr. President, 2021 is a watershed moment in the history of the world, providing a timely opportunity to reflect on the effectiveness of the UN in achieving the goals and objectives that its founders had set out 75 years ago. The multitude of challenges of today's dynamic and interdependent world cannot be addressed with outdated systems that were designed to deal with the challenges of the past. The COVID-19 pandemic has sharpened our awareness of the depth of global interdependence and of the fact that the world is only as resilient as the least resilient country. The events of the past year have clearly demonstrated how imperative it is for all countries to coordinate responses to the various challenges that the pandemic has brought to the fore. It is the lack of a coordinated global response that has exposed the vulnerabilities and weaknesses of the multilateral system as it stands today, providing a timely reminder for the pressing need for comprehensive reform. While the pandemic exposed the fault lines from unreliable global supply chains to inequitable vaccine distribution, it has also underlined the need for global solidarity and strengthened multilateralism. The reimagined post-pandemic world will make profoundly different demands from the multilateral system, which must evolve accordingly so as to be fit for purpose and capable of inspiring confidence in its ability to effectively meet those demands. Mr. President, at the core of India's call for reformed multilateralism lies the reform of the UN Security Council, reflective of the contemporary realities of today. When power structures continue to reflect the status quo of a bygone era, they also start reflecting a lack of appreciation of contemporary geopolitical realities. Multilateral institutions must be made more accountable to their membership. They must be open and welcoming to a diversity of viewpoints and cognizant of new voices. The Council must be made more representative of developing countries if it is to continue to engender trust and confidence in the ability to provide leadership to the entire world. It can deliver effective solutions only if it gives a voice to the voiceless rather than zealously guarding the status quo of the mighty. Today, the UN has 193 member states, nearly a fourfold increase from 1945. The narrow representation and privileges of a few in the primary decision-making organ of the UN poses a serious challenge to its credibility and effectiveness. How can we explain the contradiction of Africa not being represented in the Security Council in the permanent category, even though African issues dominate its agenda? Speaking on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the UN last year, the Prime Minister of India gave a clarion call for UN reform. And I quote, For how long will India be kept out of the decision-making structures of the United Nations? Reform in the responses, in the processes, and in the very character of the UN is the need of the hour. It is a fact that the faith and respect that the UN enjoys among the 1.3 billion people in India is unparalleled. Unquote. Mr. President, as a founding member of the United Nations, India has consistently displayed its commitment to uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. We remain committed to upholding the rules-based international order, underpinned by international law, premised upon respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all member states, resolution of international disputes through peaceful negotiations, and free and open access for all to the global commons. India stood at the forefront during the UN's tumultuous years of struggle against colonialism and apartheid. During our 8 terms as a member of the Security Council, we have always endeavored to be a voice of reason and understanding, a voice of the underrepresented developing world, a bridge builder for narrowing divides and for fostering consensus. We have been the leading advocate of the concerns and aspirations of developing countries and the creation of a more equitable international economic and political order. Mr. President, India has contributed immensely to maintaining international peace and security as a leading troop contributing country towards UN peacekeeping missions, having sacrificed the highest number of lives in this noble endeavor. We have also fostered global socio-economic development through transparent, viable, sustainable, and demand-driven partnership programs. On climate action, India is today one of the few countries which is on track to meet its mitigation commitments under the Paris Agreement. We have also taken the lead in launching important multilateral initiatives on climate action, like the International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Over the past year alone, we have provided COVID-19 vaccines, pharmaceuticals, and medical equipment to more than 150 countries across the world. In that same spirit of friendship and solidarity, we extend deep appreciation to those who have come forward to provide us with some priority requirements to battle the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic that we are currently facing. India has also worked with South Africa and other partners in the World Trade Organization to seek a relaxation in the norms of the TRIPS agreement to ensure quick and affordable access to vaccines and medicines for developing countries during the COVID pandemic. This waiver will be an important step for enabling the rapid scaling up of manufacture and timely availability of affordable COVID-19 vaccines and essential medical products on a global basis. In conclusion, Mr. President, we believe that a renewal of vows towards the reformed UN-centered multilateral system will require genuine efforts on behalf of all member states. For its part, India has always sought to strengthen the forces of cooperative multilateralism. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Foreign Secretary for his statement. The whole international community is supporting India in fighting this wave of the pandemic. We are convinced that India will win the victory against the virus. As Foreign Secretary said, India will support the United Nations-centered multilateral system. We look forward to greater contribution from India in the future. I now give the floor to His Excellency Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, Minister of State of the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs of the French Republic.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, distinguished ministers. We thank the Chinese presidency for having convened this meeting, and I also thank the President of the General Assembly for his briefing. The multilateralism France defends is based on the rule of law at the service of peacekeeping and international security. It is also an effective multilateralism which produces results to overcome the challenges of our time. This is the purpose of the Alliance for Multilateralism, which France, with Germany, initiated in 2019. Everything is clear. Everything is on the table. We simply wish to promote multilateralism, which is based on an effective basis of international law. And this is above all international law, the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man, the New York Accord of 1966, or the Geneva Conventions. International law also gives a framework for action where the spirit of cooperation is indispensable. And this is the spirit of cooperation that led which led multilateral diplomacy to achievements such as the Iran Agreement or the Paris Accord on climate. It must be noted that this spirit of cooperation has sometimes been missing in the Security Council. All too often, the use of the veto has paralyzed our action. How else can we justify our inability to act faced with a frightful conflict that is engulfing Syria? For this reason, France, with Mexico, has taken this initiative to limit the use of the veto by the permanent members of the Security Council in case of mass atrocities. 105 member states have already provided their support for this initiative, and we call on all members of the Council, particularly the 4 other permanent members of the Council, to join the initiative. Multilateral organizations are faced with many challenges, organizational, logistical, and financial, exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. All too often they are criticized or instrumentalized to promote national interests. These international organizations must have their true worth recognized so they can conduct their work in a transparent, rigorous, and open fashion. Once again, the law and respect for best practices within the United Nations system are indispensable. Multilateralism must also be inclusive to be effective. Inclusivity is not just a moral imperative, it is also the measure of sustainable solutions. When women fully participate in an active fashion in political processes, the agreements reached are more long-lasting. When we work hand in hand with regional organizations under the conditions provided by Chapter 8 of the Charter, we can propose more, or rather better adaptive solutions. I'm thinking, for example, of the international community's action on the Sahel. An effective multilateralism, Mr. President, is also a multilateralism focused on finding specific solutions for collective challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic is a tragedy for all too many people. It is also a test for the international community and the United Nations. France promotes cooperative solutions to the consequences of the pandemic because they are the only ones that work. I'm thinking, for example, of the ACT initiative, which we took to donate to COVAX. I'm also thinking of the efforts this Council has made for a ceasefire and all conflicts on the agenda. Faced with the consequences of climate change and their impact on international peace and security, the Security Council must not remain inactive either. This is why we have proposed that the Secretary General regularly report to the Council on this specific subject so we can take the necessary preventive measures. I invite members of the Council to reflect on this proposal. Lastly, President, dear friends, multilateralism can only be effective if it is able to reform. France supports the reforms of the Secretary General, and I hail his efforts in this area. We support the initiative of action for peacekeeping which will increase the performance and the security of peacekeeping operations. France is favorable to an enlargement of the Security Council in both categories of members. We support the members of the G4 for the to attend a permanent seat and increased presence for Africa, including amongst permanent members. France is also particularly committed, along with its European partners, to promote a reform of the multilateral architecture for health, with the WHO at its core, making it possible to better react or respond rather to health crises, both the present ones and those to come. To conclude, faced with these many challenges, France wishes to be a constructive force at the service of a results-based multilateralism. Our success in responding to the challenges of our time will come, we know, not from looking inward, but to strengthening our cooperation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister, for your intervention. We hope and look forward to great efforts by France to advance multilateralism in accordance with the UN Charter and promote international peace, security, and development. I will now give the floor to Minister Tariq Ahmed of the United Kingdom to make his statement.
Mr. President, State Councillors, good to see you and thank you for convening this important debate today. And also my thanks to President Bozkir for sharing your thoughts and indeed aspirations. The United Nations remains the cornerstone, and rightly so, of the international system. As we look at the UN's history, it has mitigated dozens of conflicts. It's saved hundreds of thousands of lives through humanitarian action. It's promoted and protected human rights and freedoms, and safeguarded the principle of sovereign equality and the right to self-determination of peoples. 75 years in, today our world faces new and complex challenges. International peace and security is challenged by threats that do not recognize borders. Climate change, pandemics, famine, organized crime and terrorism, to list a few. This therefore calls for a response that crosses borders in just the same way. We must remain true to the universal founding principles of the United Nations and indeed the Security Council. The very core values of the Charter, peace and security, development and human rights, are equally important and interdependent. To ensure the future we all desire, the future we all want, we must be guided by them and we must defend them. With these principles in mind, we must also acknowledge that the United Nations needs to adapt and reform in order to respond. Existing and new global threats and challenges, including climate change, global health, weapons of mass destruction, technology and artificial intelligence, are already testing coherence within the UN system. Therefore, to provide a truly effective response, these areas of our expertise must be fully joined up with humanitarian development and human rights efforts right across the system. The Secretary General's Sustaining Peace Agenda lays the foundation for an integrated, coherent UN system that works better together to address the drivers of conflict and, importantly, build lasting and sustainable peace. Reform is at the center of the Secretary General's vision for the United Nations, and we should all be working to support its implementation. And we all, I'm sure, agree, reform is not a one-time action, rather a permanent attitude that needs to prevail. We must all support the UN to become more efficient and more productive, whilst it continues to increase transparency. The UN human rights system also has a key and pivotal role to play. Human rights are at the heart of the UN Charter, and we must support them as strongly as peace, security, and development. We know that states which respect human rights, territorial integrity, and their obligations to their own people are more prosperous and more resilient. In an international order that is sometimes fragmented and characterized by intensifying competition over interests, norms, and values, the United Kingdom will continue to place the promotion and protection of human rights at the top of our international priorities. The transnational challenges I mentioned threaten all of our prosperity and resilience and need a coordinated approach. UN peacekeeping indeed exemplifies this. If we cast our mind back over history since the first mission in 1948, you will know that the Security Council has now mandated over 70 peacekeeping operations in more than 50 locations across the globe. Alongside the many other contributing member states, the United Kingdom has been proud to play an active role, most recently in deploying 300 troops to the UN mission in Mali. Even more broadly, as the COP26 president this November, the United Kingdom will aim to boost international cooperation and global climate finance for the benefit of us all. We have already pledged over $15 billion of international climate finance over the next 5 years, and we will spend a significant proportion of that building resilience in the most vulnerable countries. Lastly, I'd like to touch on the important issue of sanctions. We have been proud to introduce our independent sanctions measures. The UK's measures advance our national security and foreign policy priorities. They hold accountable those responsible for a range of activities, including human rights violations, abuses, and indeed corruption. They are legally robust and carefully targeted in scope to minimize any wider impact. Where we have been unable to agree in the Security Council, the UK has pursued sanctions against the likes of the Syrian regime, the Myanmar junta, perpetrators of sexual violence in Libya, or those working to support DPRK's nuclear program. We've worked in concert with others, together to stand up as a force for good in the world. As many other colleagues have already reflected, we are still in the midst of a pandemic. COVID-19 affects us all. It continues to require an inclusive global response. And as you said, Mr. President, at the current time, we all come together and stand in solidarity and friendship with India. But, as we've often heard over the past year, it is important to exemplify the key point. None of us are safe until we are all safe. Therefore, upholding the values of the United Nations Charter is key to our effective, united, collaborative response to the quite extraordinary challenges we as nations share. And finally, for all our peace and security, Mr. President, we must absolutely work together, collaboratively, inclusively, to ensure a strong, functioning, multilateral UN system. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you for your intervention. We remember 75 years ago, it was in the UK that the first UN General Assembly and Security Council meeting were held. We hope that 75 years on, the UK will continue to play its constructive role in advancing the cause of the UN. An important common understanding between all countries today is that we want solidarity, not division. We want cooperation, not willful sanctions. We need to play a greater role of Chapter 8 instead of Chapter 7. We also hope that the UK will also make its effort toward this goal. There are no more names inscribed in the list of speakers. As the President of the Council, let me add a few words.
Today's meeting is highly important and timely. We have so many foreign ministers present. It shows that all the members of the Security Council attach great importance to multilateralism. I realized that in all of your statements, you emphasized the importance of upholding multilateralism and expressed the resolve to uphold the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, and also highlighted the urgency for the United Nations to play a bigger role in international affairs. This is the greatest common denominator of all of our statements and the greatest consensus reached at this meeting. The Security Council is the core institution of the United Nations and the key platform to uphold multilateralism and resolve international disputes. As Council members, we should all lead by example in practicing multilateralism and upholding the role and authority of the UN and the Security Council. We need real multilateralism. To achieve this, the key is to stay committed to openness, inclusiveness, the rule of law, consultation and cooperation, and keeping pace with the time. The principle of extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits should be upheld. The rules should be made by countries around the world together rather than being determined by a few countries or block of countries. We believe real multilateralism is the common choice of the international community that will show us the way out of the pandemic and contribute more to the maintenance of international peace and development. The Security Council will now conclude its deliberations on this agenda. The meeting is adjourned.